It's 2:47 in the morning. Most of Tel Aviv is asleep. Passengers are scattered across Terminal 3 at Ben Gurion International Airport, some curled up in chairs waiting for early morning departures, others sipping bad coffee and scrolling through their phones. Ground crews are running maintenance checks on dozens of aircraft lined up on the tarmac. Everything looks normal. Everything feels routine. And then, without warning, the sky tears open. 12 Iranian ballistic missiles come screaming toward the airport from multiple directions at once. The first one hits the runway, then another, then the fuel tanks erupt into fireballs visible from 20 kilometers away. The air traffic control tower takes a direct hit. Terminal 3 starts to collapse. Aircraft parked in neat rows across the apron begin burning, one after another, as shrapnel and burning fuel spread across the tarmac. The entire attack lasts less than 2 minutes, from first impact to last. And when it's over, Israel's only functioning international airport is a smoking ruin. Reports suggest that 89 people lost their lives that night: ground crews, maintenance workers, passengers who never made it to their morning flights. Over 230 were wounded. But the human toll, as devastating as it is, might not even be the most consequential part of what happened, because what Iran reportedly destroyed that night wasn't just an airport. It was Israel's connection to the rest of the world, and the ripple effects of that single strike are still spreading weeks later, with no end in sight. But to understand why this one attack could reshape the entire conflict, you first have to understand what Ben Gurion actually means to Israel. And the answer to that question is way more alarming than most people realize. Here's something most people don't think about. Israel is a country roughly the size of New Jersey. It sits on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, bordered by Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. It has one of the most advanced economies in the Middle East, a tech sector that rivals Silicon Valley, a tourism industry worth billions, a military that depends on rapid logistics and resupply. And virtually all of that, every single thread connecting Israel to the global economy, runs through one facility: Ben Gurion International Airport. More than 20 million passengers pass through Ben Gurion every year. It handles the overwhelming majority of Israel's international passenger traffic: cargo, business travel, medical evacuations, military logistics that depend on civilian air infrastructure, tourism revenue, foreign investment flows, emergency supply chains, the basic projection of national stability that tells the world, this country is open for business. All of it flows through this one airport, located on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Now you might be thinking, doesn't Israel have other airports? Technically, yes. There are smaller airfields at Haifa in the north and Eilat in the south. But here's the critical detail. Neither of those airports can accommodate wide-body international aircraft. We're talking about the Boeing 787 Dreamliners, the Airbus A350s, the massive planes that carry the passenger and cargo volumes that make international connectivity actually work at an economic level. Those airports were designed for regional turboprops and smaller jets, short hops to nearby countries. They were never built for, and cannot handle, the kind of aircraft that connect Israel to New York, London, Tokyo, or anywhere else that matters for the global economy. For wide-body international operations, Ben Gurion is it, the only option. There is no backup, there is no plan B, and Iran knew that. This wasn't a random target selection. Iran didn't strike one airport out of several, it struck the only one that mattered. And that single decision turned a military operation into something far more dangerous, an economic siege that no amount of counterstrikes can quickly undo. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because the missiles that hit Ben Gurion weren't ordinary ballistic missiles. They carried something that fundamentally changes the math of modern air defense. And what that technology revealed about the limits of the Iron Dome is something that defense analysts around the world are still trying to process. Before the attack, Ben Gurion was protected by multiple Iron Dome batteries positioned around the airport perimeter. These systems were fully operational on the night of March 13th. They detected the incoming missiles. They fired interceptors. According to reports, around 31 interceptors were launched, and not a single one succeeded. Let that sink in for a moment. 31 interceptors fired, 0 successful intercepts. How is that possible against a system that Israel has marketed to the world as the gold standard of missile defense? The answer lies in a technology that has quietly changed the rules of the game: cluster munitions. According to defense analysts and preliminary assessments, the Iranian missiles that struck Ben Gurion were reportedly equipped with cluster warheads. Here's how those work and why they're a nightmare for any air defense system on Earth. A traditional ballistic missile is one object flying toward one target. Your defensive system tracks it, calculates its trajectory, and fires an interceptor to destroy it. One missile, one target, one engagement solution. The math is manageable, but a cluster munition warhead changes everything. As the missile descends toward its target, the warhead opens at altitude, sometimes several kilometers up, and releases dozens of smaller submunitions. Reports suggest the Khorramshahr 4 missiles Iran used can carry between 20 and 80 of these bomblets, depending on the variant. Each submunition is independently guided, equipped with GPS and control fins that allow it to maneuver unpredictably during descent. So what happens to the air defense system? 12 incoming missiles suddenly become potentially hundreds of separate targets, all arriving simultaneously from multiple directions, all maneuvering independently, all deploying at altitudes where the Iron Dome has minimal engagement time remaining. The system's processing capacity gets overwhelmed. It physically cannot generate and execute engagement solutions fast enough to address that volume of independently moving targets. This isn't a malfunction. This isn't poor maintenance. This is a technology being confronted with a threat it was never designed to counter. Israel's Arrow system does a solid job of intercepting ballistic missiles at higher altitudes, but defense experts have pointed out that even if Arrow successfully hits the missile body, the bomblets may have already been released. And once those submunitions are scattered across the sky, Iron Dome simply isn't built to deal with dozens of small, fast-moving objects raining down simultaneously. CNN's analysis of separate cluster munition attacks during this conflict confirmed multiple impacts spread across areas of 7 to 8 miles. That's not precision targeting, that's area saturation. And no currently deployed missile defense system anywhere in the world has demonstrated the ability to handle that kind of simultaneous threat volume. The Iranian military reportedly described the Ben Gurion strike as designed to produce maximum operational disruption and maximum economic damage. By every measurable metric, that objective was achieved. But the damage on the ground was just the beginning. What was actually destroyed on that tarmac represents one of the largest single-event aviation losses in recorded history. And the financial tsunami that's now rolling outward from those burning aircraft is something that insurance companies, airlines, and governments are desperately trying to calculate. When the missiles hit the aircraft parking areas at Ben Gurion, dozens of planes were sitting on the ground. Some were being serviced overnight, some had arrived late and were scheduled for early morning departures, some were being loaded for the first flights of the day. They were all stationary, fueled, and completely defenseless. Reports suggest that the total number of aircraft destroyed reached 73, though exact figures remain difficult to verify due to Israeli military censorship and the ongoing nature of the conflict. What we do know paints a devastating picture. El Al, Israel's national carrier, reportedly had a significant portion of its wide-body fleet on the ground that night. We're talking about Boeing 787 Dreamliners and Boeing 777s, each valued at roughly $300 million. If reports are accurate, El Al may have lost the majority of its long-haul international fleet in a single night. That's not just a financial hit, that's a capacity hit. The airline reportedly didn't just lose aircraft, it lost its ability to operate international routes entirely. Foreign airlines suffered parallel devastation. According to various reports, United Airlines, Lufthansa, Delta, British Airways, Air France, KLM, Turkish Airlines, and Emirates all had aircraft parked at Ben Gurion when the missiles struck. Wide-body aircraft carry tens of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. When that fuel ignites, it burns at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Aircraft structures melt. Everything inside is consumed. By the time fire crews could respond, most of the aircraft were reportedly beyond saving. The Israeli Air Force also reportedly lost military aircraft stationed in a logistics section of the airport. F-15s undergoing maintenance, C-130 transport aircraft, and smaller planes used for reconnaissance and communications. Those losses further degrade Israel's air transport and combat capacity at a moment when both are already under enormous strain. Analysts estimate the combined destruction at somewhere between $12 and $15 billion. If accurate, that makes this the largest single-event destruction of aircraft since September 11, 2001. But the dollar figure, as staggering as it is, isn't actually the most damaging consequence. Because what happens next in the insurance market could determine whether Ben Gurion ever truly functions as an international airport again, even after every crater is filled and every terminal is rebuilt. Aviation insurance is built on one foundational assumption, that catastrophic events at major airports are statistically rare. Insurers can afford to cover billions of dollars in aircraft because the probability of a total loss event at a major international hub is considered astronomically low. Airports are protected, airspace is monitored, defense systems are in place. The math works because disasters like this aren't supposed to happen. Except now, it has happened. And it wasn't a freak accident. It was a deliberate military strike that penetrated every defensive system in place. And that changes the actuarial calculation completely. Reports from the insurance market in the weeks following the attack have been unambiguous. Insurers are signaling that they will not provide coverage for aircraft operations at Ben Gurion unless Israel can demonstrate reliable protection against ballistic missile attack. And here's the devastating catch. Israel cannot currently demonstrate that. The Iron Dome just failed completely against these weapons. Netanyahu himself reportedly acknowledged after the attack that the airport cannot be guaranteed against future strikes. That statement alone may have done more economic damage than the missiles themselves, because every insurance underwriter in the world heard it and updated their risk models accordingly. El Al reportedly faces insurance claims in the range of $8 to $22 billion for its destroyed fleet. If that's accurate, It would be the single largest aviation insurance payout in history, and the insurers covering El Al are reportedly indicating that they will not renew policies for any replacement aircraft operating from Ben Gurion. Think about what that means. Even if El Al had the money to buy new planes tomorrow, it reportedly can't insure them for operations at Ben Gurion. And without insurance, an airline cannot legally or financially operate. Foreign airlines face the identical calculation. The insurers who just paid out billions in claims for aircraft destroyed at Ben Gurion are telling those same airlines they won't cover future operations there until the security situation changes fundamentally. If foreign airlines can't obtain insurance for Ben Gurion operations, they won't return, not because they don't want to, because they literally can't. This creates a scenario that should terrify Israeli economic planners. Imagine Ben Gurion is physically repaired. The craters are filled, the terminals are rebuilt, the debris is cleared. And then imagine the airport reopening to an empty tarmac, because no airline in the world can afford the insurance premiums to park an aircraft there. That's not a hypothetical. Based on current reporting, that's the trajectory, and the timeline for physical repairs alone tells you just how long Israel could be severed from the global economy. Runway repairs alone are estimated at 4 to 6 months. Terminal 3 reportedly sustained structural collapse and may need to be completely demolished and rebuilt, a 12 to 18-month project. The wreckage of 73 aircraft needs to be cleared from taxiways and aprons, a 2 to 3 month process. Fuel from the storage tank fires has reportedly saturated sections of the airport, requiring environmental remediation that adds another 3 to 4 months. The optimistic estimate for reopening is late 2026. The realistic estimate pushes into early 2027, but even that timeline assumes the insurance problem gets solved, and right now, nobody has a solution for that. Meanwhile, Ben Gurion isn't the only lifeline that's been cut. Because while the world was focused on the airport, something equally devastating was happening at the other end of the map, in a narrow strip of water that controls 1/5 of the world's oil supply. Since late February 2026, Iran has effectively disrupted commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman that serves as the gateway for roughly 20% of the world's oil supply and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas. According to reports, Iranian forces declared the strait closed to ships linked to the United States, Israel, and their allies. The IRGC has threatened that any vessel attempting to transit would be considered a legitimate target, and they've backed up those threats with action. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre has reported multiple attacks on ships attempting passage. At least 150 tankers have dropped anchor in open waters outside the strait, unable or unwilling to risk the crossing. The impact has been immediate and global. Oil prices surged above $100 per barrel, the highest since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. Some analysts are warning of prices reaching $150 or even $200 per barrel if the disruption continues. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels from emergency reserves, but as analysts have pointed out, that covers roughly 4 days of global consumption. It's a band-aid on an arterial wound. The pain is particularly acute in Asia. Around 80% of oil and LNG shipped through Hormuz goes to Asian markets. Japan relies on the Middle East for about 90% of its crude imports, most of which pass through this single choke point. South Korea gets about 70% of its crude from the region. Countries like Vietnam, Pakistan, and Indonesia have strategic reserves measured in weeks, not months. Schools have been closed, workers told to stay home, fuel rationing measures are being discussed across the continent. For Israel specifically, the Strait of Hormuz closure compounds the airport disaster in a way that creates a multi-axis economic siege. Sea routes disrupted, air routes eliminated. Land routes through Jordan and Egypt are slower, more expensive, and were never designed to absorb the volume normally handled by air and maritime shipping combined. The weekly economic cost of Ben Gurion's closure alone is estimated at $2 to $3 billion. Tourism revenue evaporating at roughly $450 million per week. Business travel at $200 million. Cargo operations at $100 million. Plus the compounding indirect costs of reduced foreign investment, canceled contracts, and corporate relocations that are already beginning. If the airport remains closed for a full year, some analysts project total economic damage exceeding $150 billion, and the human cost of the disruption is already visible. According to recent reports, around 20,000 Israelis remain stranded abroad, unable to return home. The vast majority are in distant locations, mainly Southeast Asia and North America, where only wide-body aircraft can make the journey. The few flights operating out of Ben Gurion are limited to roughly 100 passengers each due to security restrictions designed to minimize the time aircraft and passengers spend on the ground. Authorities want to reduce exposure during what they consider the most dangerous window, the minutes an aircraft is stationary and defenseless on the tarmac. The airport that was once Israel's busiest and most vital hub now looks, according to travelers who've been there, more like a military base than a civilian airport, nearly deserted. Eerie. The few passengers who manage to get flights describe an atmosphere of deep unease. Foreign airlines, meanwhile, are fleeing. British Airways has extended its suspension through at least the end of March. Air France pushed its earliest possible return to mid-March, then likely beyond. EasyJet, which had been planning to resume service and set up an operational hub in Israel, extended its cancellation all the way through October 2026. Other carriers are making similar calculations. They want to come back, but they don't know when the war ends and they can't afford the insurance. This economic isolation didn't happen by accident. It's the product of a deliberate strategy. And to understand that strategy, it helps to look backward to a moment 20 years ago when Israel itself used almost the exact same playbook against someone else. On July 13, 2006, Israeli Air Force jets struck Rafik Hariri International Airport in Beirut during the Lebanon conflict. The attack destroyed runways and knocked the airport out of service for weeks. Israel's stated justification was that Hezbollah was using the airport to transport weapons and personnel. The international community broadly condemned the strike as a disproportionate use of force against civilian infrastructure. 20 years later, the strategic logic has come full circle. Iran has executed essentially the same playbook against Israel: target the airport, sever the connection, isolate the country. But there's a critical difference that makes the 2026 attack far more consequential than 2006. When Beirut's airport was knocked out, Lebanon had alternatives. Damaged traffic could be rerouted through Damascus and other regional airports. The country was hurt, but it wasn't severed. Israel has no equivalent workaround. Ben Gurion is the only airport in the country capable of handling wide-body international flights. When it goes down, Israel's international air connectivity doesn't get reduced, it gets eliminated entirely. There's also a strategic asymmetry that reportedly shaped Israel's response calculus. According to sources, Netanyahu was presented with a retaliatory option in the hours after the attack: strike Imam Khomeini International Airport in Tehran. Direct equivalence. You destroyed our airport, we destroy yours. He reportedly decided against it. The reasoning, according to those familiar with the deliberations, was straightforward. Striking a civilian airport in Tehran would result in mass civilian casualties and cross a threshold that would make it impossible to maintain international support for Israeli military operations. It would invite further Iranian strikes against Israeli civilian infrastructure. And critically, it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem, which is that Israel cannot currently defend Ben Gurion against the weapons Iran has demonstrated it can deliver. Destroying Tehran's airport doesn't give Israel a missile shield. It just escalates the cycle while the defensive vulnerability remains completely unresolved. That asymmetry is the strategic core of this entire conflict. Israel can strike targets in Iran. It has been doing so continuously, but it cannot prevent Iran from striking targets in Israel with the precision and penetration that those 12 missiles demonstrated at Ben Gurion, offense on both sides. Defensive failure on one side, and no amount of bombing Iranian military installations changes that equation, which brings us to what Iran's actual strategy appears to be. Because this was never really about destroying an airport, it was about something much bigger and much harder to fix. There's a pattern emerging from Iran's actions that defense analysts and economists are starting to piece together: the airport strike, the Hormuz closure, the attacks on shipping, the daily missile barrages that force millions of Israelis into bomb shelters. Taken individually, each of these looks like a military action. Taken together, they reveal something different: an economic strategy. Iran cannot match the combined military firepower of Israel and the United States. It knows that. Every analyst knows that. But what Iran can do, and what it appears to be doing systematically, is raise the economic cost of the conflict to a level that becomes unsustainable. Cutting Ben Gurion doesn't win a battle. It isolates a country. It paralyzes an economy. It creates costs that accumulate every single day, $2 to $3 billion per week by current estimates, and that persist for years after any ceasefire is signed. Closing the Strait of Hormuz doesn't defeat a navy. It disrupts 20% of global oil supplies. It sends energy prices through the roof. It puts pressure on every economy in Asia and Europe. It turns the war from a regional military conflict into a global economic crisis that affects countries who have no stake in the fight and no desire to be involved. And that pressure, building from Tokyo to Berlin to New Delhi, creates political momentum toward de-escalation that no amount of battlefield success can counteract. The cluster munitions that defeated the Iron Dome at Ben Gurion serve the same logic. Each missile equipped with submunitions forces Israel to expend dozens of costly interceptors. Even when interception partially works, the bomblets still scatter across populated areas, forcing millions into shelters. The economic disruption of an entire country going underground multiple times per day is enormous. Productivity collapses. Businesses shut down. The psychological toll compounds the financial one. Defense experts have noted that Iran's ballistic missile launch capacity has reportedly been degraded by sustained US and Israeli strikes. But the cluster munition strategy means that even a small number of missiles can create massive disruption. One missile carrying 80 bomblets forces an entire metropolitan area into shelters and costs the defenders dozens of interceptors worth millions of dollars each. The cost exchange ratio overwhelmingly favors the attacker. According to reports, over 9,100 damage cases have been registered from missile strikes since the conflict began, including more than 4,600 in Tel Aviv alone. Buildings, vehicles, equipment, all damaged or destroyed. The daily reality for Israeli civilians is one of constant alerts, repeated sheltering, and mounting uncertainty about when or whether normal life will resume. Meanwhile, the global economic fallout continues to spread. Stock markets across Asia have posted significant declines. Oil-importing nations are watching their energy bills spiral. Countries from Ethiopia to the Philippines are facing potential fuel crises. The World Economic Forum has warned that the cascading effects could reshape global commodity markets, food systems, and financial conditions for years to come. Iran's apparent calculation is that time works in its favor. Every day the strait stays closed, the international pressure to end the conflict grows. Every day Ben Gurion stays dark, Israel's economic isolation deepens. Every day the missiles keep flying, the cost of continuing the war goes up for everyone involved. The military campaign and the economic campaign aren't parallel operations. Based on what we're seeing, the economic campaign appears to be the primary one, and the military campaign is the mechanism that enables it. When the craters are filled and the terminals rebuilt, when the debris is cleared and the fuel contamination remediated, when Ben Gurion is physically ready to reopen, possibly in late 2026, possibly not until 2027, what happens next? Can Israel defend the airport? That's the question that everything else depends on. Airlines won't return without insurance. Insurers won't provide coverage without demonstrated protection. Passengers won't book flights to an airport that their own prime minister has acknowledged cannot be guaranteed against future strikes. The technology gap that the Ben Gurion attack exposed isn't something that gets fixed in months. Developing, testing, and deploying a defensive system capable of handling cluster munition warheads, dozens of independently maneuvering submunitions arriving simultaneously from multiple vectors, would represent a generational leap in missile defense technology. Nothing currently deployed anywhere in the world has demonstrated that capability. In the meantime, Israel's economic clock is ticking. Every week, without a functioning international airport costs billions. Every month deepens the isolation. Companies that depend on international connectivity, and in Israel's tech-driven economy that's a massive portion of the business landscape, are already reportedly exploring contingency plans. Some of those plans involve relocating operations. Once that process starts, it's extremely difficult to reverse, even after the airport reopens. The stranded Israelis abroad, currently estimated at around 20,000, represent a visible symbol of the broader disconnection. But behind those individual stories is a much larger structural challenge. How does a modern, globalized economy function when its only connection to the outside world can be severed in under 2 minutes by a dozen missiles? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the defining strategic challenge that Israel now faces. And it's a challenge that exists regardless of what happens on the battlefield. Israel could achieve every military objective it has set in this conflict and still face the insurance problem, the airline problem, and the airport vulnerability problem on the other side. Iran achieved all of this without deploying a single ground soldier on Israeli territory. 12 missiles, under 2 minutes. And the consequences will be measured not in weeks, but in years. The military analysts will continue debating the interception failures. The engineers will work on the next generation of missile defense. The diplomats will negotiate. But the question that matters most right now is simpler and more unsettling than any of those discussions. When Ben Gurion reopens, will anyone actually fly there? Think about that. Because the answer to that question will determine far more than the future of one airport. It will determine whether Israel can remain a functioning participant in the global economy. And right now, nobody has a convincing answer. What do you think? Can Israel solve the defense problem before the economic damage becomes permanent? Drop your take in the comments. And if this breakdown gave you something you haven't seen elsewhere, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story is far from over.